Hey everybody, welcome back. Welcome back from the break. Appreciate you showing up. Take a seat whenever you get a chance, and we're going to go ahead and get started here. So this talk is going to be Staying Sneaky in the Office 365. Just want to give a thank you, shout out to a sponsor for this talk is Tam Noon. If you want to find out more information about Tam Noon, you can check out tamnoon.com, or you could also talk with some of the folks that are out in the lobby if you're interested in hearing more about what they have to offer. In addition to that, any questions that we have for this talk, we'll go ahead and just wait till the end. I'll bring the microphone around if you've got a question. Also, we'll have a Slack thread that you can ask some questions there, and we'll go through those. Without further ado, please welcome Christian Philipov for Staying Sneaky in the Office 365.
All right. Thank you. All right then. Well, let's get started. We'll talk a bit about what the talk is about. We'll talk a bit what was the main aim of the research. Then we'll go through the results, and then get some general outcomes out of it, and how to go about trying to defend your environment to try and detect some of these things. So pretty straightforward agenda altogether. So let's kind of kick off. So who am I? I'm Chris Philipov, one of the principal security consultants at Reversec. So I do a lot of cloud, mostly Enter and Azure, as you might have probably guessed, and generally enjoy breaking stuff. You know, sometimes I enjoy building stuff, but then I have to maintain it, so I'm kind of much prefer breaking it, because then somebody else has to deal with the after effects. So why are we here? Well, recently, and you'll find out more details about this at the talk tomorrow from one of my colleagues, Nick Jones, and then Mohit Gupta, who's presenting kind of his parts recorded, about we had a massive kind of IT migration as we moved to kind of being an independent business from what we were previously with Secure. And so we had a lot of tasks at hand to migrate. So obviously, as I'm kind of working on a lot of the Enter and Azure migrations, I do what everybody else that has, a lot of deadlines and a lot of tasks on his plate. I get bored with it. And so obviously the next best thing was I figured out, you know what, I'm either way kind of working a lot with SharePoint right now to do this migration. So might as well, take advantage of this, and let's kind of start figuring out how SharePoint actually works in a bit more detail. And so, let's do something a bit more interesting, kind of switch gears a bit, and get back into kind of the research mindset. So I decided to be a bit more adult than usual about this with the research, and instead of just kind of doing ad hoc stuff, I decided to sit down and set some goals, right? So I didn't have that much time, and I wanted to keep it simple, so I got some high-level goals that I wanted to do. For the research, I wanted to avoid using MS Graph as much as I can. So some of the talks already that have happened, kind of the talk in track 1 with Tom Byrne on kind of rebuilding road recon. Microsoft Graph and Microsoft are getting better at documenting a lot of the activities that happen against the Graph endpoint, and so that includes enumeration activities. And so I kind of wanted to see, okay, are there any kind of APIs that we can take advantage of that won't really use Graph that much, so that we can use those instead. I also wanted to discover some quick ways or methods of enumerating kind of SharePoint that can be used on offensive engagements. And ideally, wanted to discover kind of some new attack primitives or defense evasion techniques off the back of it. And so, all in all, we combine all these, and what did we ultimately get? Unknown endpoints or less explored APIs. In my defense, I know what some of you are probably saying. Does he not do anything else apart from finding, undocumented endpoints? Yes, I do, but this was more interesting, so that's why it's in the talk. So don't judge me. I'm not trying to steal Nick Frechette's crown on finding undocumented APIs. I'm just trying to carve out my little section of the Azure and Enter bits. So, off the back of it, we found 3 new cool outcomes from the research, which would be useful for somebody trying to target SharePoint, and can be useful for us as defenders to try and detect and prevent some of them. Some of them we can prevent. Technically, we can detect most of them, but you will see that, unfortunately, it's a bit complex to try to detect them. And mostly it's because of a lot of the noise that gets generated by SharePoint naturally. As I'm sure all of you are aware and have interacted with SharePoint in one manner or another, SharePoint is pretty massive and widely used in a lot of enterprises. And so there is a fundamental layer of noise that you can kind of hide in for these actions. So enough about me teasing about what the actual research outcomes were. Let's just kind of start showing them. So the first one, SharePoint enumeration. So we start off with an API endpoint that is used to get lists of items from a provided kind of relative URL within the SharePoint site. So we can see that in the A1 parameter over here on the second line, where you provided kind of the path within a given SharePoint site, and then you only need to provide this basic body of adding required fields equals true for it to actually work. And what you end up getting off the back of that is a nice kind of massive JSON blob that provides you with too many details, frankly, about the files that you're trying to find. But the one that you realistically care about is that nice file reference one, which just tells you the full path of the files within that library folder. So obviously, you do that, you collect a lot of your data about the SharePoint library, and then you can pass it through something like JQ, grab the relevant kind of reference there, and then bam, now you've got the list of all the items in that SharePoint library. So easy peasy, that's kind of gets us started. So this is good because that way we can avoid using the equivalent graph enumeration endpoint, which you can see over there, where you provided the relevant kind of site ID and the kind of what's called the drive ID for these unique resources. And that way you could typically kind of enumerate any items that you as a user have access to. So for this one, we basically only need these couple of cookies, the fedauth, the RTFA, and SIME cookies that you can get from a user endpoint. And that way you can do this enumeration activity. So you don't necessarily need to compromise and get access to a proper graph token. There's no login in the graph activity logs for this one. There are events that you can see in the Office activity logs and kind of the unified audit logs. But like I kind of said a few minutes ago, the problem here is that this is an activity that happens very naturally when people just use the basic search functionality within SharePoint through the web browser. And so it is incredibly hard to properly use this as a single kind of detection metric because it is fundamentally noisy. That's just how it is. But okay, great. We managed to get kind of one objective down from the research topic. So let's try and find some more interesting ones. SharePoint token exchanges. For the people that were at the other session in track 1 with Tom Byrne, kind of talking about Road Recon, you got a bit of an idea of how access tokens and refresh tokens work within Entra and Azure. They slightly deviate from the typical kind of all-out spec of how they should be implemented, in the sense that they allow you to use a refresh token to mint access tokens for various kind of resources and client IDs. In this case, typically, a lot of that happens through the main kind of Microsoft endpoint, which is login.microsoftonline.com. And that's kind of primarily what you end up using to do a lot of these token exchanges. However, SharePoint itself has its own equivalent kind of access token exchanging method that exists within a given kind of SharePoint site. So you can see there's the /sites, then the name of the site, and then this SP auth token acquire endpoint. The main thing that you do is in the body, you want to supply it with the resource that you want an access token for. And then off the back of that, you get a nice little request response that gives you the access token that you've requested. And also conveniently, it already tells you the types of scopes that you get from that access token. Oh no, a lot of the scopes are kind of read-only. So in that sense, it is a very useful token for sure for enumeration activities, because this way you can basically pivot from access tokens you manage to get from SharePoint directly to start interacting with the graph itself. But there are a few of those permissions that can be a bit more dangerous and useful kind of for an attacker. You've got site selected, so that could allow you access to particular sites kind of that the access token is allowed to talk to. Another interesting one is you can do user invite all. So technically, if there are restrictions in terms of only certain users are allowed to invite guest users to the tenant, then this permission should be enough, this scope should be enough if you manage to get one of those users tokens to then send out guest invites to other accounts that you've got access to. And then kind of user revoke sessions all, kind of a useful one from a denial of service perspective if you want to start kind of booting people off their active sessions. But yeah, all in all, it's not kind of a fully critical access token that you manage to get, but it will definitely get you going from an enumeration perspective. Like all in all, it's a very simple and straightforward way of just asking for different resource URLs and then getting tokens from it. Now, the good thing about this is that the endpoint does have some limitations. You can't just exchange tokens for arbitrary resources. These are the couple of resources that I managed to kind of confirm that the token exchanges works for. So you can get an access token for at least some of these resources, including your obviously specific kind of SharePoint instance that you've got within the tenant. The usage of the refresh token to kind of get getting these new access tokens is still visible to some extent in the non-interactive kind of enter logs. So there is still evidence of that activity happening in the tenant. However, this comes back to the same problem we had with the first method, which is this is activity that SharePoint does naturally in the browser as people are just using it. Every now and again, it refreshes the tokens to get new ones. So every user using SharePoint will be doing this. So frankly, unless an attacker is doing a significant amount of these refreshes to try to get new access tokens, it will be incredibly hard to make use of the audit logs available to actually build detection cases around this. Okay, great. From the initial kind of research goals that I've set up, I played around with it with a few days, managed to get a couple of interesting kind of outcomes already. I started sitting down to document them and move back to actually doing some of the less interesting tasks. But then obviously that isn't exactly what ended up happening because we ended up finding one more interesting one just as I was kind of finishing up. So this is typically the request that you will see when you try to kind of open a file or preview a file within SharePoint. Pretty straightforward. You've got the path to the library, you've got this OItems ASPX file, and then an ID that points to a specific kind of full path to the file that you're trying to get to. So in this case, flag1.txt. Okay, great. So I was playing around with this and checking out the response. One interesting thing that you encounter when going through the massive JSON blob, this is just like 0.5 megabyte worth of a request, by the way, which I think easily suggests why SharePoint can feel a bit sluggish if every single request is almost of that size. But anyway, we've got two specific fields that are interesting. We've got download URL and then download URL no authentication. Now, you would think that this is the dangerous one, but not actually, because this is the actual URL that you get when you interact with the file and try to download it naturally through SharePoint. Because what this ends up using is that this effectively popstats obviously is in the actual HTTP request, and then it uses your access token to download the file and verify that you've got access to this and that you are allowed to access this, and then downloads the file based on those checks. But the download URL one is interesting because I'm sure most of you have probably spotted there's this nice URI parameter called temp authentication. And I think a natural question that probably a lot of you are asking right now that deal with Microsoft is, what is this? I've got no idea what this is. And now was exactly the same, because this was the first time I ever encountered that properly, especially with the fact that the token is ever so slightly different with this V1 kind of first part to it. And despite the fact that the rest of the token seems to kind of follow a very standard kind of JWT token format that we're used to. So, obviously, finding this, I was like, okay, let's try to find some more info about this. What's there. But unfortunately, that wasn't particularly successful. This seemed to be a very weird one where there wasn't really many references at all to this as a thing. There are a couple of references to temp off being used in the context of kind of OneDrive downloading, but it's slightly different. It uses a more standard kind of JWT structure there and is used more so kind of for modern interactions and kind of handling kind of larger files or kind of downloading larger sequences of data and kind of handling that authentication part. But there wasn't really proper references to this kind of format within SharePoint. Eventually, we did find one reference after a bit of fiddling around, and it was within the PowerShell module documentation for SharePoint Online's kind of PowerShell module about getting the SPO tenant pre-auth settings within the environment. Luckily enough, somebody had decided to add a nice little note to it, which explained, or at least gave some context of what's actually happening. And basically, you can go and read through it, but for the most part, it effectively is kind of like a pre-signed URL for those familiar with AWS. And it generates this access token that is to be used for kind of more rich download scenarios to kind of handle downloading files without having to go through the typical authentication process of how a user would typically access stuff, right? Also of note that the feature is currently being deprecated, but it's still live up until last evening, so I don't know how long that's been there and how long it's in the process of being deprecated, but anyhow. The question I'm sure a couple of you are asking is, okay, great, what's the impact of this? Well, the practical impact is that we can download files from SharePoint. We can download files from anywhere. Some of you that have kind of done SharePoint administration and management know that there is a setting in SharePoint that you can restrict who you can share files with. And most organizations, especially the ones that are more kind of have access to sensitive data, default to only allowing users to share files within the same organization and disable anonymous link sharing, right? This bypasses that. This doesn't care if it's set up to disable any sort of anonymous sharing or public sharing. These links will work regardless for the 1 hour period that token is valid for. There's an additional security control within SharePoint that's a bit more powerful, which you can even restrict from a network location who can download whatever or in general interact with SharePoint. And so if you're not from an allow listed IP in SharePoint, you just get fundamentally blocked from the service to the point where you can actually lock yourself out easily from SharePoint. And so Microsoft do make a clear point to just make sure that you add an IP that you do have access to, because otherwise you have to raise a support ticket. This one bypasses that. It doesn't do any of that checks. So even if the IP is not allow listed through that setting, you can still download it as it worked. And so any member with the ability to read a file automatically generates these tokens in every single request that's sent to kind of read or open that file. So, good news. Using the helpful kind of commandlet that either way gave us a hint of how, what's actually happening, we can use that to confirm what's the status of this functionality and feature within our tenant. So you can see in this case, it is enabled because we couldn't just label it enabled equals false, but we have to go the double negative there. And the lucky thing is that at least from a prevention perspective, we can also easily disable this by running only one commandlet. I raised it to MSRC to try to see kind of what's the opinion and whether or not this is expected. Unfortunately, not exactly the what I expected from MSRC, but basically they determined it's a low severity issue because anybody with the ability to read a document can find ways to export the document in some way or another, right? Which, yeah, I can get that. But the part that I particularly liked from the response is the last part, which is that we do not consider this a security feature bypass. Instead, we see this jumping a security guardrail. Some of you might ask, isn't this kind of the same difference? But I don't know. I'll be honest. I'm still kind of wondering about that one. But at least the lucky thing is it's easy to resolve. It's easy to check. So hopefully most organizations can kind of quickly remediate this. So overall, in conclusions, we've got some cool new /old defensive agent techniques and kind of methods that we can use the SharePoint APIs to do kind of offensive activities. You know, there are some new approaches that there's definitely, you know, still some time to do like further research into, and I would definitely recommend anybody that's interested in this to kind of have a play themselves, because I'm sure that there's probably a trove of other similar functionality that people can discover, and it will be good fun for the community. We have a way to prevent or detect some of them. Mileage might vary. I'd say definitely still focus on kind of the more high impactful stuff instead of necessarily kind of putting in significant amount of efforts here. But I would definitely recommend at least to look at that pre-authentication configuration within your tenant and probably disable that, because at least from my Googling, as I said, basically no real references to this whatsoever at the moment. And so I can't really see any legitimate use case of this within a tenant. So I think it's pretty safe to say you can probably disable it and it won't impact any workloads. Obviously, test it in a test environment beforehand. As much as I like to YOLO and prod, you know, maybe don't. But yeah, that's it for me.
Nice work, Chris.
Thank you.
Okay, so any questions from the room here for Chris? I see I've got one over there, making my way.
So you said you have ways to detect this. Are those documented as well that you can share?
So the detection for the first two we kind of talked through in the sense that there are audit logs either in the Office activity logs for example, file access and kind of that sort of file listing that would give you some hints if somebody's trying to enumerate SharePoint. However, because it's also what users genuinely do when they just visit it, it is a bit hard to make proper use of it. You can probably try to make some sort of baselining, but that's going to likely yield some false positives, so just keep that in mind. For the second one, for the token exchanges, you can look at kind of non-interactive like refreshes from a given user to getting kind of minting new access tokens. But again, because SharePoint does it naturally under the hood as well, very often, that's also going to be significantly hard. I'd say even harder than the file enumeration stuff. The last one for the download and kind of pre-authentication stuff is also hard, because essentially what you're going to be looking at in the audit logs is somebody kind of reading a file. And unfortunately with SharePoint, that's kind of a pretty natural thing that everybody's going to be using. So you can maybe build some detections around it, but I'd say probably your better bet is to focus on trying to disable that feature all in all, because then at least you have a consistent method of accessing these files, and you know that there is no way that you can anonymously kind of share these directly from SharePoint itself. But the actual act of somebody downloading that file from, let's say, some IP, or if somebody has that link, I couldn't see any logs of that within it, because technically it happens before any authentication process whatsoever. And so I don't think that the logs would actually have that available, even in the Office activity logs. So you'd basically be relying on trying to guess if somebody's read the file and maybe exfiltrated a token from that and then used it to download files from somewhere outside of your kind of network control.
Thanks.
No problem.
Awesome. Other questions? Yep.
Thank you, really good stuff. Just one question, did you try decoding that token that was in the signed URL at all?
I did. It kind of decodes, but not completely. There's some parts of it which are just basic base64, but the formatting of the token, I need to sit down to kind of go through what they've got in terms of like some of the C# classes that for decoding tokens, and just see kind of what specific method to use for that one. The answer is yes, but it's kind of incomplete of a decoding. But it definitely seems like it ties it to a given user identity that within a SharePoint user identity specifically, not an Entra one. You can kind of get the expiry, but other claims kind of interest, not really at the moment. Some of it is just kind of garbage data, at least at the moment.
Cool, thank you.
All right, awesome. Thanks for all the questions. If you've got any more questions, I would say reach out to Chris afterwards and continue the conversation. With that being said, let's give a final round of applause here for Chris. We appreciate it.